Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest Retail Think Tank discussion. I'm Alicia Esposito, Director of Content and New Media for Retail Touchpoints. And I have to tell you, I am so excited for today's conversation because I have John Rossman on the show. He is an innovation expert, a thought leader on all things disruption, and author of The Amazon Way. We're going to get into your career, John, but first and foremost, thank you so much for taking the time. Great to have you.
Alicia, thanks for having me. I enjoy your work, and I've listened to a few episodes and all the prior leaders that have been on here, so I really appreciate the opportunity.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for saying that. But a lot to cover in a short discussion, so let's get into it. You have held executive roles at Amazon for several years, and you helped launch and scale the marketplace business, which I think we all can agree has played a really significant role in Amazon's growth and just their overall position as a large centerpiece, I guess you could say, of consumers' browsing and buying behaviors today. We are going to get into your book, The Amazon Way, but first, I do want to just reflect a bit on your experiences, your learnings, because, wow, what a company to not only be a part of, but help grow and scale. So why don't you set the stage by sharing a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I was at Amazon from early 2002 through late 2005. It was a fascinating period at Amazon. I did play a key role in launching and scaling the marketplace. So that's third parties selling at Amazon.com. That's over 58% of all units shipped and sold. And I also ran a business that was called Enterprise Services, where we ran other large retailers' e-commerce infrastructure for them, Target.com, Toys R Us, Marks & Spencer in the UK, a bunch of other great brands. And it was a fascinating period because we were really figuring out that Amazon was essentially two types of companies. We were both a retailer and we were a platform company, and a platform company that creates tools and capabilities that we both used, Amazon, but also others used, right? And so AWS is built off of that kind of pattern, and the marketplace and CreateSpace and a bunch of other platforms that Amazon has done. And we were really figuring out, like, well, how do we operate together? What do we prioritize? What do we really believe leadership means in an actionable, mechanism-driven approach? And so when I was at Amazon, the leadership principles, they weren't codified, but we were living them every day, and we were hammering them out. And it was sometimes after I left Amazon, and I started my own firm, Rossman Partners, and it was a client of mine at the Gates Foundation who pulled me aside. This was 5 or 6 years after I'd left Amazon, and said, you do a real nice job of inserting all the little techniques and strategies into our work. You ought to write a book. So I talked him into being my partner on these. And that's really been my work since Amazon, which is helping others take what are the real positive things out of Amazon, because they're so deliberate in how they approach their work and how they think through strategies that it's extremely transferable in at least the manner of it gets you to think about these things, right? Like, how do we set strategy? How do we prioritize? How do we hold each other accountable? And it's been just a great story since then.
Yeah. I like the word you used in your response, deliberate. And I think, that's something that companies are thinking about a little bit more. Like, how can we be intentional? How can we be deliberate in how we work, how we collaborate, and also how we instill innovative thinking, right, and decision making. And I believe personally that companies like Amazon are big drivers of that, have helped bring that into the consideration set for not just, executive leaders, but for the people who are in the weeds, people who are part of these teams. And I know Amazon has been a point of inspiration for a lot of people. It's a company that it's a bit of an enigma almost. Like, people want to study it. People want to understand understand how it works, what models are used, how they can implement it, which, you're addressing, which is fantastic. But I want to talk about the other people, because obviously you lived and breathed it, so you know firsthand. But a lot of people like to study Amazon. They like to report on Amazon. And, there are a lot of analyses, I guess you could say, out there about how they've worked, how they do things, their culture. Is there anything that a lot of the folks out there get wrong or maybe misinterpret? Because again, you've been a part of the culture. What do you think is most important to note that is a myth or misconception about the Amazon world or culture?
Yeah, well, I think a lot has changed. And what you have to understand is where Amazon comes from, right? They come from, when I was there, we were being doubted, we were being shorted. It was Amazon.con, Amazon.org, Amazon.bomb. It was all of these naysayers saying we weren't going to be successful, and we had to fight for success. And so we grew up in an entrepreneurial, scrappy, frugal was one of the leadership principles. And while that spirit is still great, I think that is one of the things that, as Amazon has now, is now like you could call it utility infrastructure for e-commerce and infrastructure. I think that there's some subtlety that they need to think through. So, we're releasing the 3rd edition of the Amazon Way. And what's new in the book, I rewrote a lot of the sections, updated it with a bunch of interviews, but I wrote a new preface to the book. And for the first time, I'm making a suggestion to Amazon. It comes not as a criticism, but as a strategic point of view, because what's going on is that there's really essentially 2 narratives about Amazon, right? One's all the like, hey, they're so innovative, look at all the cool things they do, and the other is challenging them on all of the impact that their business has in our society, right? And so this takes the form of whether it's unionization, worker safety, marketplace fairness, the leverage they have in their business. They have a narrative that I think is going to be a very long road for them. And so I was like, well, gosh, if I were lucky enough, and I don't pretend this would ever happen, but if I were invited in by Andy Jassy, the new CEO, and said, John, like, what advice would you give us relative to kind of this narrative that's going on? I would say, like, look at what you did 2.5 years ago when you were taking a lot of heat and narrative from a senator about worker wages, and you were already like at parity. But what you did was you said, listen, we're just going to reset the bar. We're going to make it $15 an hour for every worker starting next week. They didn't hesitate at all. Completely reset the bar, reset the narrative. And that to me is just a maestro move. And so what I'm suggesting in the new preface is that Amazon does something to add to their leadership principles. And in Bezos' recent annual shareholder letter, which is always the best reading, there's kind of a buried headline in there. And he writes, he goes, when we lead, others follow. And very simple line, but it's absolutely true. And what we need as a society, as a democracy, as a competitive environment is we need Amazon to lead and others to follow. So the preface I write is basically a suggestion to Amazon to add a 15th leadership principle. And that 15th leadership principle is basically about doing unto others as you would undo to yourself. And I expand on it and I kind of write it in a style where like the other leadership principles are written, and so that it's hopefully durable and can be used in both today's circumstances but tomorrow's circumstances. And I think it would be both effective internally for Amazon leaders, and it would help reset the external narrative. And I think that's what people, back to your question, like what people are getting wrong is this notion that Amazon doesn't care or isn't one of the absolutely world's best employers, but so many of the topics that they're being tackled on are topics that, like, any other company in this type of business, they have those exact same issues, likely worse. But I think it's fair to say, well, we expect better from Amazon. And I think Amazon is saying to itself, we expect better from ourselves too. In the same shareholder letter this year, Bezos talks about, we need to create a new vision for our employees. And he says, that vision needs to be Earth's best employer and Earth's safest place to work. And so I think even Amazon is realizing, like, we're good, but good's never been our bar on anything. Like, our bar is to, initially was the world's most customer-centric company ever. And I think that they're resetting the bar for themselves. And I think that's what's being presented wrong in much of the narrative today.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. It's funny, John, when you're going through, some of the, key perspectives and your recommendations, that quote that popped into my head was like, with great power comes great responsibility, right? Like, everyone is holding, Amazon to a standard, and that standard permeates across multiple things. It's customer experience, it's, accessibility of product and opportunity for smaller brands, it's delivery and fulfillment, it's, the more environmental and social responsibility side of things. Like, there is impact and an opportunity to influence and drive positive change across the board. And it's just like, when you unpack everything, it's like, wow, there's a lot here. There's a lot that's been done, but there's a lot to do, which I guess is the big opportunity, right?
Exactly. And, you can talk about, like, the last 25 years. What I'm interested in is the next 25 years, right? And, Amazon, I think their last quarter, they grew, was that 43% year over year? So you haven't seen company dynamics like this before, right? Where they're, roughly a $320 billion organization growing at 43% a year, which is, typically you're in the single digit growth rate numbers at this point. And so we've really got to be thinking about the next 25 years. Amazon is playing the game that we absolutely want every company to do, which is serve customers, run a great business, right? Return for shareholders. That's the basis for capitalism. But there's something more that they need to do. And I think that growing social responsibility is really the essence that's behind all this. But don't expect them to put policies in place to do anything that any other company wouldn't do. And that's where, like, when I hear people complaining about Amazon, it's like, don't complain to Amazon. Don't write to Amazon. Write to your senator. Write to your politicians. It's their job to create the playing field, the rules which we play by, and it's companies who play within those rules. And that, to me, is like, what's missing here, which is modern policies that catch up with a business model like Amazon.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it makes me wonder, too, like, how else they're going to be influencing not just retail, but the broader business world, right? Like, with the acquisition of MGM, they're really doubling down on their original content and, the Prime ecosystem, I guess you could say. But there's so much other stuff in the works too, like healthcare. So it's like, it makes you wonder, like, how their approach to innovation and driving change is going to evolve. Like, what's going to be required from a process standpoint. And you're the expert on innovation and tackling disruption. So I mean, do you have a perspective on how their approach may need to change or adapt? Because, like, I'm looking at this through the lens of, like, the retail executives who are watching this now, who may be exploring similar opportunities, like ways that they can find new revenue models. So I mean, like, how do you change your way of thinking to think bigger?
Well, Amazon's true spirit in all of this, they say it, and it actually is the truth, which is they pay attention to competitors, but they obsess about customers. And my advice to anybody out there is there's never been a better time to serve customers. And what I would truly do is understand your customers deeply, have a broad understanding of their day, of their job, of their journey. Understand where you fit, but look broader than that and be extremely curious about what's going on with them. And in particular, especially when you're in the B2B space, this may not be quite as relevant to brands, but in the B2B space, what you always want to be doing is finding problems. Like, well, what happens when things don't go right in that customer journey, in that customer day? That's where the opportunity is. But, reducing friction, making it easier, following your customers and really understanding that deep persona of who your customer is and serving that customer. That's, I think, everybody's journey towards success. And I wouldn't ever feel like the game is over, that you can't do it again or whatever. I think there's never been a better time to grow a brand and to serve customers. But old models don't work. Like that's the point that people have to grok. They have to deeply understand here. And that's what I try to tackle in my work, in my keynotes, in my books, in the client work I do, which is, hey, the playbook that you've used to get here maybe needs to be adjusted. It may not get you to where you need to go. There's a ton of things that you can pull from a company like Amazon and apply into essentially your management science, your leadership skills. And you use the term intentional leadership. That's something I riff on a lot, which is intentional leadership. And leadership is actually a skill. It's a process, right? And you need different skills, different techniques for different moments. This is a wartime CEO and a wartime leadership mantra that's needed. And that war is called the digital era, right? So we have to change faster, more deliberate. We have to get better at how we make little bets, test them out, figure out what's going to scale, what's not scale. When we scale it, how do we scale it? When we decide to adjust, how do we adjust? But that game of experimentation plus your ability to scale, those are the two things you have to be able to master as a leader now. You can no longer be just a good operator, right? You have to be both a great innovator and a great operator.
Love that. So with that, let's dig a few layers deeper then into some of the actionable lessons and takeaways, because I know that that's really the meat of your book, right? Like you get into leadership principles, things that, readers can apply to their business, especially fellow leaders. So let's look at this through the lens of retail specifically, of course, since that's our audience. And a lot of change has happened in the past 18 months. You talked about like the new revenue opportunities, the goal to think in a larger context of consumer needs and their day to day. But let's get into the specifics of those leadership principles specifically. Are there any ones that rise to the top for our executive viewers right now that you think, okay, like this is an easy, I don't want to say copy and paste, but this is something that, retail executives can easily apply in their day-to-day and start to unlock some of those new ideas and new ways of thinking and working?
Yeah, let's start with some things that sound easy, but it's the application that's critical and is hard. So leadership number 3 is called invent and simplify, right? And what I always found is fascinating about that is like, invention sounds so critical and so hard and so elusive, but Amazon recognized that simplifying is as critical and as important as invention. So let's talk about just the simplification piece of this, right? We like inventing, like, okay, that might not be our game, but simplification. And it's simplification, not just of the customer experience, but actually like our own internal operations, right? And so let's tackle both aspects of simplification for customers, simplification for internal capabilities. So think about like one of the big trends, one of the big shifts, one of the big accelerations through the pandemic has been order online, pick up in store. Does anybody think that experience today is a great or finished product. I just ordered something from my local grocery store, went to pick up. The parking lot is so non-conducive to an actual pleasant experience, a safe experience. Think about a mom who, your shopper is a mom who's doing that with a busy life. How do you actually make that order online, pick up in store a great experience? And how do you actually make it a profitable piece of your business? Why don't you, in addition to bringing out the stuff I ordered, look back at my order history and go, well, they typically bring this along too with their order, or these types of items maybe go along with those things. Why don't you bring those out as an option and just say, hey, would you like any of these things too today? Oh yeah, throw that in there and everything, right? And you just automatically add it to the tab. And so those are aspects of truly getting at the details, the friction in the experience that you need to constantly innovate and refine, and then when you get it better, you scale it across your entire enterprise. But those are just the creative moments of problem solving. Like, that's the stuff I love, is not theoretical, but actually solving a customer experience. So now let's talk about internally. So one of the great lectures I got from Bezos was about how, we had allowed the easy thing in a business to become the hard thing in the business. And a good leader really only lets hard things be truly hard. And that you have to have good wisdom, right? You have to recognize, well, when should something be simple versus when is something actually complex, and you recognize it's a complex simplification. But think about all the things that go on in an organization where you go, well, that should really be simple to do, but just the way we run our meetings, we respect job titles and our organization structure too much, and we let things become bureaucratic. And so much, I think, of the essence of Amazon is, how do you get your organization structure out of the way to do the right thing for the customer, right? Like, that's customer obsession, is like, how do we put the customer at everything that we do? And we ignore the other stuff that doesn't matter to customers. Customers don't care about your org structure. Customers don't care about job titles, right? Customers don't care about how P&Ls are divided up within your organization. But yet in software products, there's this concept that, software companies ship their org structure, right? That happens in other companies too, which is you ship your org structure. So get your org structure out of the way of deciding what to do. How do we do that? Like, what are the mechanisms to do that? Understand better what decisions we need to make and who is the decision maker to do it. Have lively discussions, which is about putting the customer first and data, but then respect the decision maker's ability to make the decision. And that's where leadership principle number 13 from Amazon kicks in, which is called disagree but commit. And so when you have lively discussion, but you respect decision makers, then what we all have to do is we all have to buy in to wholeheartedly work to make that decision better. But if we do things on more of a trial basis and then scale, those decisions become less stressful. Like, we can adapt to them better, right? And what does this do? This increases innovation and it increases speed in the organization. And speed is a competitive factor in today's world. And so especially when we're trying new things, we have to understand, we need a different decision-making rights and decision-making process for how we run innovation experiments versus how we scale our business. So those are a couple of the things that you can do to actually speed up and become more innovative, all built off of the principle invent and simplify.
Yeah. I love them. I feel like those three concepts together really pack a powerful punch because it inspires that action. I think sometimes, like for retail especially, the hardest part is taking that first step, right? Because of all of the red tape, all the players in the decision-making process. But we saw, like over the course of the pandemic, retailers really just get things up and running because that was what was required to keep things moving. And like you said, not perfect, but hopefully this will inspire, folks to continue to test and learn, try new things, find new ways to surprise and delight, which I think is where the creativity and the, the fun stuff kind of comes in. But I guess the follow-up question for you is, how do you inspire that creative thinking? How do you encourage that open forum, I guess you could say, of new idea sharing and new ways to look at things? Because, I feel like we hear so much about like, oh, agility, fail fast, just like you said, commit to the idea and see what happens. But I feel like sometimes that's easier said than done, depending on the company and like what their culture is like. So do you have any recommendations for the folks watching that want to inspire, folks across the business to think more creatively, share ideas, but, they need to, I guess, communicate that need and that openness?
Well, I mean, to some degree, that's the mission for books like The Amazon Way, is when you can point to a both an exemplar, like, hey, they kind of got something going on there, they do something, and something with some tools, a little bit of a recipe book, that goes along with it, that can help. But it's not the full answer. That's where, leadership matters, right? Like, this tone from the top is the critical essence. Like, why are some companies more innovative than others? It like, there's a lot of factors there, but it comes down to leadership, right? And that leadership understanding of the nuances of, hey, when are we experimenting? When are we making bets versus when are we operating? When are we scaling? And that subtlety escapes so many people. So you have to have both, I think, kind of a model or an exemplar that you can follow, but then leaders got to lead. They have to buy into it. When I get asked to, work with a team, like, hey, we want to create an innovation agenda, it's like, where's the CEO on this, right? And if the CEO, if they're just like, yeah, I want to give this a try and everything's like, okay, job one, I have to turn that person into the fanatic on this, like the cheerleader. They can't be just kind of going along with it. They have to be leading the charge, because if others sense like, yeah, that the CEO or the business leader's not bought into this, and they may come back and truly evaluate me on kind of the old school, metrics and results versus the new playbook that we're talking about, people don't move, right? It's safer to stay where I am and kind of have that same level of, well, I'll just watch and observe a little bit, right? And so that's what you have to do, is you have to, there's calcification that goes on in cultures and organizations. So you got to break up the calcification, and it's a different rubric, it's a different approach for every place, but it comes back to leadership and a different set of techniques that are needed depending upon your circumstances. So it's never one thing. I think one of the things that Amazon does more of than any place I've ever been involved with is around metrics. And how do you use metrics to give you a signal of where the customer experience isn't good enough, and then take that signal and drive it into action, right? Most places, they really use metrics as a way of kind of patting themselves on the back, right? Like, God, we're doing a great job on that. You know what I mean? The reason you have metrics is to find the noise, is to find the imperfection. And so there's a real art and a craft to creating metrics that tell you where's that noise. And then you have to create the mechanism. We had one at Amazon, it's called metrics meetings, right? Where you get together and you debate the metrics. But these are meetings of accountability and action, right? They're not there to congratulate ourselves. Like, if we aren't finding the noise, we raise the bar, we raise the SLA so that we start getting into the new noise. Well, that's where it becomes an innovation driver, right? Because you're changing the level of expectation. So those are all the little tricks that go into it. It's not one thing, regrettably. I wish it were one simple thing, but it's a combination, but it does come back to leadership.
Yeah. And it makes sense there is no silver bullet to this, because it does really depend on the company, their existing culture, what their needs and goals are. So I think to start, you gave people a lot of food for thought. So thank you for doing that, John. And again, third edition of the book, congratulations. Really excited to dig into that. But if we were to kind of distill, points from the book or even our conversation today into a few tactical takeaways that can be implemented, can be done in the short term for our executive listeners and viewers right now who are ready, they're eager to implement this culture of innovation, creative thinking. Does the answer lie in some of those, smaller, achievable actions such as understanding the customer a little bit better, revisiting their needs, those metrics type meetings? I mean, you tell us, what are some quick hit tips and steps that folks can take to get started on their journey right now?
I think you have to combine kind of the quick hits with like, hey, what's the journey we're on, right? So you need a little bit of forward-looking introspection of like, okay, what are we trying to solve for? And then go to the quick hits. But, I like the ones that you mention, but I think about fundamentally understanding that innovating, trying something new is different than scaling and operating at scale. And I always talk about what do we think being digital means, right? We're all on this, digital transformation train and journey. Most companies don't really understand, well, what am I targeting there? Like, how is it different if I'm digitally transformed or if I'm customer centric? Like, what's actually different in my organization? So take time to define, like, hey, just give me examples of things you do today that aren't customer centric or aren't achieving what you want to do, and what might the future look like. We use this exercise called a future press release at Amazon when we were launching a new product, a new service, or making any type of change. And it was essentially a visioning exercise that got to tactics like, well, what would it actually be like to be successful at this? And then you can go to some of the simple mechanisms to practice. How you run meetings, an essential one, right? Decision-making rights relative to those, understanding your portfolio of things that we are trying to be agile on and innovate on. You have to have one type of playbook versus those things that we're scaling and trying to operate at perfection, different type of playbook. Those are a couple of the things that I think are good getting going maneuvers to help start, breaking up the calcification and creating change in an organization.
Love it, John. I love that idea of the future press release because I've heard a lot about like visualization and like vision boards for like personal goals, but the future press release, I think that's a good activity that everyone watching now can do and, start to map out what you want to be known for. Like even if it seems like a, far shot or, something that's super big or not, achievable in the short term, I think it's a good exercise for you to really see what's possible. So,
and I break down kind of the recipe for the future press release in the Amazon way. And it really goes to, like articulate the future from a customer, from a user's point of view. But then B is break down the hard things that we're going to have to solve for in order to achieve that vision, right? Like, what is it that's going to have to change in order to do that? Don't talk about how you change it because you haven't done it yet. Just get them on paper. And then wherever you can, appoint, we have this term called single-threaded leadership, right? Appoint a single leader in the organization to drive this mission that's now in this future press release. But make sure everybody knows, like, relative to that mission, we all work for that person, right? Like they're the leader driving this, and senior leaders really have to support that endeavor and that mindset. And one of the benefits that comes out of this is you start getting your organization structure out of the way of how you accomplish a mission. So you learn, like, hey, org structure is good for some things, but it really gets in the way of most of the work that we have to do goes across our organizational boundaries. And we know for certain our customers don't care about our organization structure. So we have to get better at breaking those things down.
Beautiful. Well, John, I feel like we could go on and on for hours, but I think now is a good time to close things up. But thank you again so much for taking the time out for the insightful responses, the best practices, and even a few of those short-term actions that executives can take. Really appreciate the time.
A great conversation. I really appreciate your preparation and everything you guys do. So thanks again.
And to all of you, thanks so much for joining us for this conversation. Again, The Amazon Way, 3rd edition, jam-packed with some great insights, best practices, lessons from the incredible world of Amazon. John Rossman, author of the book, disruption expert, innovation expert. We'll be sure to include some links to the book details and to his site so you can learn more. And of course, if you're hungry for more fantastic conversations like this one, please check out the Retail Think Tank. We'll be sharing some great brainstorming sessions and some great candid conversations around some of the trends that are shaping the future of retail. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.